name is Tommy Prud'homme. I'm the pastor here at Salado United Methodist Church. We're a church where everyone is welcome, where we seek on a daily basis to grow deeper into the love of God and one another, and where we reach out to our community and the world around us to share that love. I'm so glad you're here with us today, and I hope through this time with us that you will get to experience a little bit of God's love for yourself.
Good morning. My name is Joshua Stearns, and I will be reading from Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11 in the NRSV. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. This is the word of God for the people of God.
So there they were, free, but also out in the middle of nowhere. See, the Israelites, they had grown up, as far back as anyone could remember, they had grown up as slaves. They'd been born as slaves, their parents had been born as slaves, their grandparents had been born as slaves. Their whole life was oriented around doing what they were told to do as quickly as they could possibly get it done. The concept of freedom was utterly foreign to them, as was the concept of one God. They were raised in Egypt. They were raised in a polytheistic culture that believed in lots of different gods, that worshiped lots of different gods. And then this guy named Moses shows up. And he says to them, I represent the one true God who is going to defeat all of these Egyptian gods and is going to lead you to freedom. And the Bible records their reaction to this, and it was not positive. They thought he was crazy. But then God did what God said God was going to do, defeated those Egyptian gods through these 10 plagues, led the Israelites out through the Red Sea into freedom. So there they were, free, and out in the middle of nowhere, out in the wilderness, camping out underneath this mountain, the mountain called Sinai. If you've been with us on Wednesday evenings, we're actually studying a book now in our Wednesday evening study. It's called The Epic of Eden. It's by Dr. Sandra Richter, and she calls those Israelites camped out at the base of Mount Sinai a group of former slave polytheists considering monotheism, trying to figure out how to worship one God. And so that's what we've got there at the base of Mount Sinai. We've got these people who had been raised as slaves. They didn't know anything other than slavery. They didn't know how to live free. They didn't know how to worship one God. All they knew was worshiping lots of different gods. So how's this going to work? How's God going to get them to a place where they can worship just one God, where they can live as free people? I mean, it almost seems kind of hopeless, especially if you know the rest of the story and how they just kept wandering around in the wilderness because they kept disobeying what God told them to do. Now, as we read about the plight of these polytheistic slaves considering monotheism, I think we've got a tendency to say to ourselves, well, bless their hearts.
Maybe a little bit of condescension in there saying, I am so glad that I'm not like that. Really. I think if we really look at ourselves and our lives, and in particular our culture, we may have to conclude that we aren't quite as different from those Israelites at the base of Mount Sinai as we think. Now, of course, we are here this morning, and again, you get gold stars for that. We are here on Sunday morning because we believe in the God that Moses told those Israelites about. But what about the other 6 days of the week? What about Monday through Saturday? Who or what do we worship then? Because we live in a culture that is every bit as polytheistic as the culture that those Israelites grew up in. And we don't have lots of little figurines that we worship, but John Mark Comer in the book Ruthless, Elimination, or Hurry, he says we as a culture worship the twin gods of accomplishment and accumulation. We are constantly bombarded. If you turn on your computer, if you turn on the TV, we are constantly bombarded with the message that we aren't enough, we don't do enough, we don't have enough. And if we just do it a little bit more, if we just be a little bit more, if we just get a little bit more, then we would be fulfilled. Then we would be happy. It's been said that one of the ways you can figure out who you really worship is to pay attention to what you spend your time, your attention, and your money on. Jesus put it this way. He said, where your heart is, that's where your treasure's at. And by that standard, I think a lot of us would have to acknowledge that we're right there with the culture. We're right there worshiping those twin gods. We're right there on that treadmill of success. We're right there in the middle of that American dream. Just as enslaved, not physically, but spiritually and psychologically to the culture around us, to those twin gods. Bottom line is we are not nearly as different from those polytheistic former slaves considering monotheism than we would like to think. So how did God help them? Maybe that could be instructive for us, right? How did God help them? What did God do for them? How did God enable them or teach them to live free? How did God teach them to worship just Him? And it's really pretty simple. At least it's simple to say. It's not quite so simple to do. Because God knew He was starting from scratch. He knew He was starting from ground zero. He knew there was no basis, no foundation there to build on. And so He just basically gave them an instruction manual. He says, here's how you do it. It's called the law. It's laid out in the first 5 books of the Bible. And He starts that law out. He starts out that instruction manual. Here's how you live free. Here's how you worship just me, with the 10 Commandments. And right there in the middle of those 10 Commandments, commandment number 4, the longest of the 10 Commandments, the most detailed of the 10 Commandments, God tells them, remember the Sabbath. You want to live free? You want to live worshiping just me? Remember the Sabbath. Which raises the immediate question for us, right? Because he's talking Hebrew. What does Sabbath actually mean? The English translation of Sabbath is really pretty easy. It simply means in English to stop, as in to stop working, to rest, to not engage in productive activity, which to our ears sounds weird, right? How can just sitting there possibly constitute worshiping God? What does freedom have to do with just sitting there? Well, as it turns out, quite a bit. Because, again, in this longest and most detailed of the commandments, God explains why they need to remember the Sabbath. God says, because God worked for 6 days and then rested on the seventh. See, God built into creation itself this rhythm of work and rest and work and rest. It's built into the very fabric of the universe. It's built into us, especially because we were created in the image of that God. We were created to participate in, to be a part of, and to live our lives in accordance with that rhythm of work and rest, work and rest. But we got to remember that as Moses is talking to these folks, as God is talking through Moses to these folks there at the base of Mount Sinai, they didn't know what he was talking about when he said freedom. Again, that concept didn't make any sense to them. The concept of rest really only made a limited amount of sense to them, right? Because again, they had lived their lives at the whim of other people. They had lived their lives being told what to do, how to do it, when to do it, get it done as quick as you can. Their value, their meaning in life was defined by what they could produce and how fast they could produce it. They may have been created to live in a rhythm of productive work and rest, but the culture in which they lived told them that their value and their meaning was solely related to what they could make and how quick they could make it. The culture around them told them, yeah, rest, not so much. You got to go, go, go 24/7. Now, does that sound at all familiar to anybody? I mean, the concept of rest, the concept of Sabbath is just as foreign to the culture we live as it was to those early Egyptians. The concept of just sitting there, it doesn't even compute, right? Because for us, think about it, our value, our meaning in the context of our culture is defined by what we can produce and how quick we can produce it, by what we can get and how quick we can get it. Now, it hadn't always been this way. And some of y'all are old enough to remember when Sabbath and Sunday kind of meant the same thing. And when our culture recognized Sunday as a day off, as a day of rest, as a day of just sitting around. No shopping, no organized activities. But as our culture got more secular, it began to view the Sabbath as kind of a religious relic, right? And as a religious relic, it just kind of got rid of it, just discarded it. Wasn't relevant anymore. But the thing is that Sabbath is not a religious relic. In fact, it's not even a religious thing. It's a human thing. It's how we were created to live. We were created to live in that rhythm of productivity and rest, productivity and rest. I mean, it's why we spend a third of our lives asleep. It's how we were made. And when we don't live that way, we break. We break down. We burn out. I bet you most of the people in this room, if you think about it, you could find times in your own life where you've been there, where you've been in that breakdown, where you've been in that burnout, because you're just going all the time. And you don't have to look far at all. Look at the culture around us, right? And you can see that that is going on at epidemic levels all around us. Physical, mental, psychological, spiritual brokenness. When we live 24/7, we break. The light bulb finally came on for me. It was 2014. I was in charge of the Consumer Protection and Antitrust Division at the Texas Attorney General's office. I was taking a full load of seminary classes, and I was preaching in Gerald. And I was taking probably one of the 3 or 4 hardest classes that I took my whole time in seminary. It was a class on Exodus, on the book of Exodus. And we got to the 10 Commandments, and the teacher asked us, he had us write a little paper on how we observed, how we remembered the Sabbath. And so I told him, I said, what I try to do over the course of a week is string together 12, 16 hours for the whole week, not counting the 4 to 6 hours I was getting for sleep. And I try and rest during that time. And his response, this is an online class. You'd think it would take a little. His response was like this. It was almost immediate. He said, "That's not rest. That's not Sabbath." And then he said something that has struck with me to this day. He said, "With your schedule, you don't have time not to experience Sabbath. You don't have time not to experience real rest." So I've changed some things around, and pretty much since then have managed to remember the Sabbath. Now, one of the things that John Mark Comer says in this book, Ruthless, Elimination, or Hurry, is that the Hebrew word Shabbat can be translated not only as to stop, but also as to enjoy or to delight in. Just as God stopped on the seventh day, he didn't have to, right? He's God. He wasn't tired. Why did he stop? He stopped to enjoy and delight in the creation that he had made. And he invites us into the same thing when he's telling those Israelites, "Here, take this Sabbath." He's not like shaking his finger at them saying, "Look, y'all need to do this or I'm going to be mad at you." He's giving them a gift. He's inviting them into the way they were created to live, to enjoy him, to delight in him and all the gifts that he had given to them. And he invites us into the same thing. And the best part of it is that when we start doing that, when we start taking that Sabbath seriously, when we start really resting in God's presence, it starts to permeate the rest of our lives, right? It doesn't become just one day a week. It becomes a way of being, right? That peace, that joy that we find in God's presence becomes more and more a part of who we are the other 6 days of the week. So how do we do it? How do we actually do Sabbath? And there's no short way that I can explain it to you in the 2 minutes that I've got left. But 3 things I want you to remember. First, Sabbath doesn't mean Sunday. In our culture, it's kind of been that way, but some of us, like me, Sunday's not an option. I got to find another day. For me, it's Friday. The key is to find that day that is your Sabbath, to find that day that works for you, to find that day that you can rest in God's presence and delight in God's presence. Second thing to remember is Sabbath is not translated to mean the day to get all the stuff done that you didn't have a chance to get done earlier in the week. I admit I have occasionally been guilty of this. It's a day of rest, which brings me to the third point, and that is rest is going to be different for everyone. It doesn't mean just sitting around. For me, I find rest, I find peace. It's kind of meditative for me sometimes to mess around out in the yard or to go for a hike. For some of y'all, that may sound like a nightmare, right? Key is to find what works for you, to find what brings you joy, what brings you peace, what brings you into God's presence, and to do that. It's not a chore that God has given us to do. It's not some kind of punishment. It's a gift. It's a gift of living our lives the way we were created to live them. So let's remember the Sabbath. And I want to give us just a few moments to do just that. So what I want you to do, I'm going to give you about 30, 45 seconds. Remember those things that bring you peace. Contemplate those things that bring you joy. What are those things that bring you into God's presence? That's your Sabbath.